Hi and welcome to simracing. To the surprise of many, game developer studio Kiloton Racing and publisher Nakon released a demo of their upcoming WRC 10 title. It was only available for a week just to give the players a taste of what's to come. So I decided to put together an analysis video of the WRC 10 demo based on my experience driving it. It turned out to be quite a lengthy one as there's a lot to be discussed. I hope you are ready and strapped in because this is the WRC 10 demo deep dive. Now before we start, it's important to keep in mind that this is just a demo and not the final product available at launch on September the 2nd. I don't know which development build is used for this demo, but what I do know, and is also very important to keep in mind, is that the final 1.0 build should be done and dusted within the next few weeks or within the next month. The developers need to have that 1.0 build ready 1 to 2 months before the actual release date. Some of the negative things I'll be highlighting can still be resolved before launch, but there are some that I'm sure of won't be, and they are actually big ones. To give you a quick overview, I'll start off by giving you another news update on what we know about the cars, locations, features and more since the release of my previous news update video. If you haven't seen that one, you can find a link in the description down below. Once that is done, I'll dive right into the WRC 10 demo itself. This part is divided up into several major sections ranging from peripherals to graphics, 3D model textures, audio and sound quality, physics, etc. Within each section I'll go over the positive and negative aspects in detail based on my knowledge and experiences in combination with video footage and imagery to support it. Obviously there will be comparisons with its predecessor WRC 9 and other rally or racing titles to highlight certain aspects or to show differences. And finally, at the end of the video, I'll wrap everything up by offering you my thoughts and concerns when it comes to WRC 10. Right, so let's begin with the segment where I give you the latest news update based on information I gathered since the last video. Firstly, at Nakon Connect we saw a new clip where Sébastien Loeb gave his opinion on the game and reveals what the purpose will be of the historic rally event, which is something we already knew. Sébastien praises the game, which isn't really a surprise as this is pure marketing and he's basically reading a script Nakon gave him. I do have to point out that what Loeb says doesn't always match up with what's being translated. At the very end we hear the phrase, a lot of drivers wrote their name in the history of the WRC during all these years. Then you hear Loeb say the word dangereux, or dangerous.
A lot of drivers wrote their names in the history of the WRC during all these years.
That word is never used by the translator, which is a bit odd. Sébastien could have been talking about something else entirely at that point. There's also a moment where the written and spoken translation doesn't line up, which is again very strange. In the following snippet you can see the written words will be featured in the game, however the translator says this.
All of that will be featured in the game.
Yes, he says we featured in the game. This shows that it is indeed scripted and actually contains some mistakes. Moving on to the game's footage then, I immediately noticed things are very similar compared to their gameplay trailers. First of all, the engine sound is not from in-game but just an overlay. Secondly, the 3D car models look rather underwhelming. It doesn't scream quality, does it? Lastly, the lighting and reflections are Once we jump into the deep dive, all these aspects will be addressed in more detail. The other bit of news update has to do with content. The developers / publisher have been marketing the arrival of 2 major brands in Mitsubishi and Subaru to the franchise. We know that they are referring to the Mitsubishi Lancer Evo 5 Group A and the Subaru Impreza S3 WRC from '97. Everyone's been very excited to drive these legendary cars, but I'm afraid not everyone will be able to, at least not from launch. At the end of the clip we can see that the Impreza is a bonus car for players who pre-order the game. If you don't pre-order it, you won't be able to drive it. Now I must say that it doesn't look like the car is modeled with quality and detail in mind. Oh, and even though the ride height and the size of the wheel rims and tyres suggest this is the gravel spec version, it actually isn't. This is what the tarmac spec version in the game will look like. Yes, I know they keep making the same mistakes, even though this is completely new content. Anyway, The same goes for the Mitsubishi Lancer Evo 5 Group A. That car, together with the Arena Panzerplatte stage and the 3-month WRC Plus subscription, is part of the game's Deluxe Edition. Again, if you don't buy the Deluxe Edition, you don't get the Lancer or the Arena Panzerplatte stage. Now, most likely players will be able to buy them as DLC a bit later on, but probably not from launch, perhaps a few weeks or even months later. And I suspect plenty of players will be disappointed by this, including myself, but there is a very good reason why they do this. These two cars and that stage are in those bundles for one reason and one reason alone: to boost pre-order and deluxe edition sales. So with the update segment of this video wrapped up, let's continue with the WRC 10 demo deep dive itself. We'll start off with the UI, and I must admit that everything looks very good. It has a nice layout, great to look at, clean cut, nicely structured and easy to navigate. All you need from a UI. 10 out of 10 in my book. The next section focuses on peripherals, as my initial experience loading up the game was mainly centered around this, to say the least. Using a Thrustmaster TSPC Racer wheel, T3PA pedals and a TH8A shifter, I immediately ran into a whole load of problems, as did almost every player using Thrustmaster gear, as well as basically anyone not using Fanatec gear. It took me 4 hours of painstakingly trying out different ways to just be able to have my wheel working before I eventually figured it out. My solution did have one downside though: I couldn't use my shifter and had to map the handbrake to one of the buttons on the wheel. Then it took me an additional 2 hours to set up the wheel in game to have it feel somewhat natural, because the default steering and force feedback settings are absolutely atrocious. Now, in every post on social media by the developers, people made sure that they were aware of these issues, and luckily for the Thrustmaster players, the devs eventually put out a patch that solved everything. Unfortunately, players with high-end direct drive wheels, not of the Fanatec variety, were still suffering at that time. So when it comes to peripherals, the demo suffered from quite a rocky start. It looks like people owning Fanatec gear won't have to worry about major hiccups in the future, and Thrustmaster and Logitech owners hopefully won't have to either by the time the game launches in September. Everyone else, especially those using high-end direct drive wheels from brands like SimuCube or AccuForce, probably won't be so lucky. Proper support for these brands in the past has been lackluster at best, and it looks like that trend will continue. I wasn't able to test the game out with a controller, but I did get some feedback from a friend. He said that playing the demo with a controller feels very similar to what he experienced when playing WRC 9. For people using other types of peripherals like VR or motion rigs, I'll quickly rip that band-aid off. There won't be any official support for it. Sorry guys, I know it's 2021 and we have come to expect these features to be implemented, but once again it won't be there. I'm 99% sure we'll have to wait until Codemasters are handed the WRC license in 2023 to finally have the feature added to the franchise. The studio and team developing that title will already have the tech and experience from developing previous titles in the Dirt Rally franchise. I do want to mention the following though. Some people in the community already stepped up and created third-party mods that allow you to play in VR or with your motion rig. There are links in the description down below for those people who want to check out these mods. Next up are graphics, visuals and graphical optimization. First off, I'd like to state that the overall quality has improved from WRC 9, particularly when it comes to coloring, and in 4K or Ultra resolution the franchise has never looked better. Having said that, most of the player base don't have the luxury of being able to afford equipment that allows us to enjoy it in 4K, for example, and when you see what those people have to deal with, it becomes clear that the game does not perform very well or consistently at the moment. Almost everything that follows from this point forward is based on what I experienced using the equipment I have available. My GeForce GTX 970 is becoming rather outdated, but considering the fact that I can play Dirt Rally 2.0 or Assetto Corsa Competizione at 1080p on at least high graphical settings without any problems, means that I should be able to run the WRC 10 demo smoothly on similar settings. The developers also stated that an older driver version of the Nvidia cards should help resolve some of the major issues those people have encountered. I checked it out and it did indeed slightly improve, and I was able to use similar settings as I would in Dirt Rally 2.0 or Assetto Corsa Competizione, but only in sunny and clear conditions. For any of the other conditions I had to lower the settings considerably. And again, this is but a demo, so I do expect they will optimize it some more and hopefully sort out some of the major bugs and glitches people have encountered so far. Now, by the time the game releases in September, visually the game will look exactly the same as in the demo. And even though the improvements over WRC 9 are noticeable, I must admit that it's still some distance away from the graphical quality and fidelity many other titles within the rally or racing genre have to offer, especially for resolutions on the lower end of the scale. As I mentioned in the past, there are moments when the game looks rather nice, but then there are also plenty of moments when the game just looks absolutely terrible. What I found really odd is that the quality close by, as in the first few meters around the car, is crisp and rather detailed for the most part, but once you look a bit further into the distance we lose lots of that detail. It's something the developers need to sort out, and I hope they will be able to do it. So, fingers crossed, touching wood and all that. To illustrate what I mean exactly, I'll show you several screenshots and bits of in-game footage from different camera angles in 4K. Yes, even at that resolution we see this gremlin crop up. Something else I'm not a fan of personally has to do with the lighting, brightness, shadows and the reflections. These elements I didn't like in WRC 9 and unfortunately will remain part of WRC 10 as well. It has improved compared to its predecessor, but it's far from what it should be. First of all, the default brightness is still way too high in my opinion, which becomes very obvious when you select clear conditions during the day. My eyes are one of the very few parts of my body that still work perfectly fine, yet they do start to hurt after a while. I checked the menu to see if I could turn the brightness down a notch, but to no avail. Luckily I did find the solution by turning down the brightness in the settings of my TV, something I've never had to do before when playing a game. With light and shadow, again the developers didn't stick the landing and it's something people noticed right away. The difference going from light into shadow is too extreme. In the light it's too bright and in the shadow it's too dark. It's definitely better than what we had in WRC 9, but it's still not good enough. Furthermore, the way light reflects off different objects continues to look off. That's certainly the case when sunlight, for example, reflects off the body of the car. In real life, the body panel here is made from metal and has a glossy layer of paint on it. Now, as far as I know, this is not what reflected sunlight should look like. Every single car model reflects light as if they were covered by a layer of matte paint. Another situation which is really bugging me as well when it comes to reflections has to do with the way the rear brake lights reflect off the road surface. Something that has improved though is the reflection of objects like traffic signs, banners, etc. They no longer blind you completely. So the visuals in general have improved, but not to the extent I would have expected. That might have to do with the limitations of their design engine, but I rather doubt that. Graphical optimization on the other hand is a whole different story. Now that is to be expected as polishing everything up is one of the final phases of development. Having said that, they'll have their hands full because the game needs a lot of polishing. As I mentioned before, I can usually run my games on high to very high settings without encountering any drops in frame rate or stuttering. In the WRC 10 demo on the other hand, that's not the case. From the very beginning I put everything as high as possible to see what the result would be. And I must say I did expect quite some stuttering and drops in frame rate, but not to this extent. It was basically unplayable. I lowered everything too high, but I was still experiencing lots of stuttering and frame rate drops. Just as a reminder, Dirt Rally 2.0 or Assetto Corsa Competizione runs about completely smooth on similar settings. So back to the menu I went to lower them even more. On medium graphics the game was running almost smoothly with the occasional stutter here and there. I still encountered some minor frame rate drops when driving in open areas, but once I reached a section with a large density of trees and shrubbery, the frame rate went down quite significantly. After I installed the Nvidia driver version they recommended, the drops weren't that extreme, but they were still there, as you can see from this footage.
Into right 3, into left 3, short, 80. Caution, left 1.
Other optimization gremlins I discovered while driving are objects like boulders you can just drive through like nothing's there, a light fog that appeared in places when driving in the dark in completely clear conditions, and when I lost my light pot at some point, there was still enough light and the same amount of light coming from the car. The largest amount of optimization issues crept up when checking the replay footage, and not just from the TV camera view but all the camera options that are not on board, dash or bonnet. Let's just go over the list. The tires look shockingly bad at high speed. They also suddenly stopped rotating for one or several seconds. The car disappeared a few times. Windows seem to be missing when the car is further away in the distance. and lots of objects or bits that fell completely out of focus and looked extremely distorted. This poor graphical optimization can and has to be sorted out, and I sincerely hope they will at least get it to a point that it is acceptable. However, from past experience, we know optimization isn't one of Kiloton's strong suits. Let's move on to our next talking point, which is partly connected to graphics: particle effects. What I mean by particle effects is the formation, transition and movement of smoke, dust and water particles. Yes, I'm looking at something like this too. I told you this was a deep dive, didn't I? Now, focusing on dust clouds first, they have received an update, but I feel like they went a bit too far, and I do see some elements when it comes to their formation and transition where my brain goes, that doesn't seem right. I do realize that with some of the following things I'm a bit nitpicky, but I do want to mention them just to be thorough. Looking at this footage, we see that the dust cloud develops from underneath the tyres, which is completely normal. So far, so good. But from the moment it starts forming behind the car, it just disperses like it would when you drive a normal car on gravel roads. What we see in real life is the impact of the aero package and the airflow it creates on the formation of dust clouds behind the car. Looking at Elfyn Evans on the Fafe stage in Portugal, you can see that the dust comes out of these aero vents as well, and also how the wing has an impact. I know it's somewhat of a minor thing, but I always enjoy watching the effects of the aero packages at work. What I do have a problem with is the inconsistency with which dust clouds form and disappear. Some of the dust clouds hang about far too long before they disappear, and some of them almost instantly disappear once the car is off the loose surface. I'll illustrate this by using replay footage posted by someone in 4K. The final bits the developers need to optimize are the dust clouds that just move through any and all objects, including solid rock faces or stone walls, and some of the flickering in the dust cloud itself. Moving on to tyre smoke then, I noticed on several occasions whilst watching the replay that tyre smoke is generated around the tyre but doesn't spread out behind the car, something you can see in this clip clearly. Another thing I picked up is that tyre smoke is generated too frequently. There are situations on tarmac where the car is not even sliding or the tyres are not spinning out, yet there is smoke being generated from them. When you slide gravel tyres on tarmac, like you would on the rallycross circuit in Estonia, there shouldn't be that much smoke. Again, these are elements they need to improve. Last but not least, we have water particle effects, and well, ta-da! That's all we have at the moment in wet conditions, which isn't a lot, is it? I'll just play this short clip to show you what the water spray behind the current gen WRC cars looks like in real life when the roads are wet. And it's not just the spray behind the car, but also the way water is animated when going through a water splash or puddle. It looks really terrible. In my opinion, Richard Burns Rally has a better looking splash animation. Then we have raindrops that don't look very realistic and for some reason never fall on your windscreen. So yeah, there's only one thing for this: unacceptable. The following segment is focused on 3D model textures. Now, I already touched on the lack of quality when it comes to graphical detailing in some places, and with the 3D model textures of the cars, road surfaces and environments, it's more of the same. Looking at the 3D car models first, I must say I'm really disappointed. There are some very minor improvements here and there, but that's definitely not enough. The current gen WRC cars lack overall depth to them as well as qualitative detail. Add the exaggerated brightness or the way light reflects on them and the results are not good, especially when you look at most of the other race and rally titles out there. Checking out the Ford as if it were in a showroom makes it look rather good, doesn't it? However, there's quite a drop in quality once you are actually out there on the stage. Of course, that's not uncommon in racing games, but the difference is just way too extreme. Where KT Racing has truly dropped the ball is with the 3D models of the classic cars. Even in the showroom there are some that look absolutely horrendous. Not all of them, but way too many. You look at this image of the Alpine Renault A110 Berlinette in the showroom and it looks nice apart from a few minor design hiccups. I can't see the car on the stage, but based on the drop in quality with the WRC cars, I can say without a doubt that it'll be the same with the classic cars. But then I saw something which really shocked me, and I'm not joking, it almost made me cry. Have a look at the proud Lancia Delta HF Integrale Evoluzione in the showroom. I mean, where do I even start with this? It's just bland, there's barely any depth to it, from every angle the car lacks detailing, and the list goes on and on and on. This is without a doubt the worst 3D car model I've seen in years. It looked terrible in WRC 9 and 1 year later it's still exactly the same, which makes it even worse. There's not a shred of passion or love that went into designing this model. Seriously, let's compare it to the game's major rival, Dirt Rally 2.0, from a similar angle. Look at the difference, it's huge! Besides, it's on a stage and not in a showroom. And I'm not stopping here, let's go a step further and compare it to a car model designed by an amateur modder. Yes, you heard me correctly, the following 3D model of the Lancia was not designed by someone whose job it is to do it and is paid for it, but by an amateur modder who did it in his spare time for free. Then I thought to myself, right, how far back in time can I go and still find an amateur mod of this car that looks better? Well, here you go. This is an image of the Lancia Delta mod which was posted in 2015, created for Richard Burns Rally, a game that is 17 years old. You can see there are more details on the grille, the bumper and around the headlights compared to the image of WRC 10. It's just baffling to me, honestly, how can anyone at KT Racing be happy with this and sign off on it? And the Lancia Delta Integrale is not the only car that will suffer from this, as I've seen screenshots from other classic cars which are equally as bad. It's a real shame to have those legendary cars look so dreadful in a rally game releasing in 2021. Moving on to yet another poorly executed bit of 3D modeling that just keeps reappearing in KT Racing's titles despite the community's outcry, the tarmac tyres and wheel rims. I touched on this countless times before, so I'll keep it brief. Both the tyres and the wheel rims have the wrong size and shape. Add to that the blandness of the textures, the lack of depth, the lighting and more, and it's just an absolute disaster. Let's just go ahead and quickly make the comparison. Here we have the tarmac spec Ford Fiesta WRC from WRC 10. Now this is what the actual rims and tyres should look like. Just an absolutely terribly executed job. So I went on the internet to see if they ever addressed this over the years, and I came to the staggering conclusion that they haven't been updated since WRC 6, which was released 5 freaking years ago. It seems like they can't be bothered even slightly, which is an absolute shame. The cars are the centerpieces of the game and should be modeled better than anything else, and yet they aren't. In fact, they are amongst the worst. Now when it comes to the damage model, it needs some tweaking as well. I'm using the realistic setting, but when I slid wide in 5th gear in Estonia and crashed into a telephone pole with the side of my car, I got away with just a minor dent and the door that was open. No puncture, no mechanical issues, just some minor bodywork damage. In reality that pole would have snapped off and my car would be ready for the scrapyard. Moving on to the road textures then, as I suspected, the roads in Croatia for example do indeed have potholes that are 3D modeled, however there are also quite a few of them that are basically painted on to look like 3D textures. Instead of the suspension soaking them up and the front of the car dipping down, you just glide over them and don't receive any feedback through the wheel. The environmental textures received a similar treatment. Some elements are decently modeled and animated whilst others are basically 2D textures made to look like 3D ones. If we check out the following screenshots, you can immediately spot these, even in 4K. The developers did decide to put more environmental bits and bobs along the roads like bushes, trees and other objects, which is something I don't mind. It feels more alive somehow, if that makes any sense. I think that's pretty much the only positive thing I can mention. So when it comes to 3D model textures, I'm truly disappointed as it looks rather outdated. It really falls way short of the standard set over the last couple of years in the racing game genre by titles such as Dirt Rally 2.0, Assetto Corsa or most other racing games. I don't expect any major changes before launch either, because rectifying this mess would be a mammoth task for which there's neither enough time nor budget left. Next up we have audio and sound quality, which has always been the worst aspect of the KT Racing developed WRC titles. They said that the engine sounds and the audio in general has been overhauled, and that is indeed the case. Whether it's actually an improvement or not still remains to be seen. Personally, as of right now, I believe they actually took a step backwards. Each WRC car now has a distinctive and unique engine sound, but it is still far from what the real cars sound like. find it very odd that they are just unable to reproduce the correct engine sounds despite having full access to the cars and teams via the license. And other sounds like skidding or hitting objects on the stage
Into left 3, keep into right 3.
are completely unrealistic at the moment. I'm not sure how much the audio and sound quality will improve between the demo and the game's launch, but I don't have much faith in it. It seems like they will never be able to get it right. Dirt Rally 2.0 is still the benchmark, as their audio and sound quality is absolutely marvelous when it comes to rally games. However, I do want to mention that the people behind the F-mod for Richard Burns Rally did one hell of an amazing job as well. The only part of the sound in some way that has improved is the co-driver. In English, the co-driver has a nice and clear voice and sounds more or less like a normal human being.
Into flat left, keep into right 5, short, into flat left, caution 30.
Speaking of the co-driver, how are the Pacenotes? Well, they are somewhat detailed with enough information for each of the corners. If the information is always correct, on the other hand, is hard to say. Developers usually choose one of the following two systems. The first one is where the numbers refer to the gear the driver should be in. If that is the case for WRC 10, then there are quite a few mistakes in the Pacenotes. There are lots of corners where I'm able to select 1 or 2 gears higher than what my co-driver says. So it's probably not that one. The second system is the one we see, or should I say here, in Dirt Rally 2.0. It's the system that Colin McRae himself used to navigate his way through the stages. It's an angle-based system where each number refers to the angle of a corner, as you can see in this image. If WRC 10 uses a similar system, then there are still some odd calls that don't really match the corner's angle. Where that's most prevalent in the demo is the extremely tight sections on the Spanish stage. There are some very optimistic calls in there. This corner shouldn't be a brake left 1, but rather a brake hairpin left. And this one shouldn't be a left 2, but rather a left 1. I suspect we might see some changes to the Pacenotes, as it doesn't seem like a time-consuming job to adjust them. So most likely they are using an angle-based system, which might be confusing or frustrating for casual players. Nevertheless, in my opinion, it's the right choice and decently implemented. We follow this up with another positive aspect to WRC 10, which is the stage layout. I'm not talking about how the stages are to drive or how they look visually, but just the way the roads are laid out. They might not be completely accurate or as narrow as their real-life counterparts, but they have a fantastic layout, as there's always a nice variety or combination of technical and fast sections. Those that instantly come to mind are the one with the very narrow section in Spain and the stage in Estonia with the section on the rallycross circuit. I like the stage layouts in Dirt Rally 2.0 a lot, but like many, I'd love to drive stages that have a similar layout to the ones in the WRC games as well. I would have loved to see some form of stage degradation in WRC as well, but unfortunately that won't be part of the game. And finally we have the big one, physics and handling combined with force feedback. The reason I put these two together is because you really can't discuss one without mentioning the other. And I'm not just focusing on car and tyre model physics, but also on surface physics. It's not going to be a very detailed technical talk, but more along the lines of a series of descriptions of how it feels to drive, supported by footage. Now first of all, I'll compare the physics and force feedback in general to its predecessor WRC 9. And credit where credit is due, on gravel it is a massive improvement. In WRC 9 it felt horrible and very unnatural to drive on gravel, but in WRC 10 it feels a lot better. In WRC 9 you are just floating on the surface and it feels like the tyres are completely disconnected from the surface. Now that disconnection is not completely the fault of the physics, but rather a combination of the physics and force feedback. I received very minimal feedback on my TSPC racer in WRC 9 on gravel, despite the numerous attempts of tweaking the force feedback values. In WRC 10 the cars, or more specifically the tyres, feel more connected to the road, mainly because of the massive improvements to the force feedback. However, I do need to quickly touch on the fact that the default force feedback settings are absolutely horrendous. I did mention at the very start that it took me 2 hours to dial in my wheel. Well, those 2 hours were mainly spent chasing the force feedback values to find the sweet spot which offers me just the right amount of everything. Now on tarmac it feels a bit more natural as well, but the difference between both titles on tarmac is not to the same extent as on gravel. The problem I had in WRC 9 was that I didn't know what the front wheels were doing most of the time when braking or entering corners, as the wheel didn't give me the right feedback. Again, similar to gravel, the tyres felt somewhat disconnected due to the lack of feedback coming through the wheel. In WRC 10 the feedback you receive is more detailed. So the physics in general have improved, especially on gravel, but it's the force feedback that really surprised me in a good way once I found that sweet spot. Like I said, there's a lot more feedback coming through the wheel from the tires and suspension in the forms of shakes, rattles and rumbles. Something else I noticed, which is an improvement over WRC 9, is that you now have a better gradually increasing force when turning the car. What I'm referring to is feeling the weight of the car shift through the wheel. It's more pronounced than in their previous title. Now, I clearly stated that when it comes to the physics they were improved, which is true. But does that mean that we can put them next to the top dogs in the rally or racing genre? Well, unfortunately not, and there are reasons for that. What I'll do next is pick out certain elements and analyze them, starting with the car and tire physics. After that, I'll quickly touch on the surface physics as well. The developers stated that a lot of work has gone into better replicating aerodynamic forces. WRC cars of this generation have massive aero packages which are striking to look at. Now the main purpose of those packages is to create as much downforce as possible. When it comes to cars, downforce is a term that is used to describe the force created by the aero package that pushes the car downwards. So what the aero package of the WRC cars does is controlling the flow of cold and hot air in a specific way in order to create the most amount of downforce. The more downforce is created, the more grip the car, or more specifically the tires, will have, meaning you are able to corner a lot faster. In a game it's very difficult to replicate that, as it requires a huge amount of time and resources, as well as a team of very intelligent engineering people. And rarely does it occur that a studio has all three at their disposal. I don't know about KT Racing's resources or if they have people that are experts in aerodynamics, but what I do know is that time is not on their side. They have to release a title every year, and you can only do so much in such a short time frame for something which is so extremely complex. So what most developers do is find a solution which is not too complex or tricky, but still mimics the effects of those aerodynamic forces. When you are driving, it's not easy to really notice or become aware of how detailed it is, because your main focus is on the road ahead and the voice of the co-driver. But once you start watching lots of footage from various angles, you can fully focus on the visual clues in the car's behavior, and that's when you begin noticing certain things. So when it comes to downforce, it's difficult to explain, but I have a suspicion that it's not the aero package that pushes the car down, but it's rather a force underneath the car that pulls it down. If you are thinking, what the hell is this guy on about? Well, let me demonstrate with some footage. The situations where this effect is most noticeable is when the car goes airborne. Normally, when a car lifts off the ground, it travels a certain distance in a curved motion depending on the speed, like you can see in this clip. Comparing it to the following clips of WRC 10, the car just gets pulled down almost immediately, which looks very unnatural. And I thought that describing it as if the car was being pulled down by a magnet seems like the most accurate explanation. Now the thing that really jumped out for me can also be seen in those clips, and some of you might have picked up on it already. The suspension and chassis/body seem to be almost completely disconnected from one another. I started noticing that very early on when I began playing the demo. Whilst explaining what I mean exactly, I'll let you watch footage of my run on the Estonian stage with the Ford Fiesta WRC, and hopefully by doing this you'll start seeing it too. So a road is never perfectly smooth, and every single car is affected by any dip or bump in the road. People who drove the very first cars ever produced will definitely agree with me there. After a while we invented car suspension, which is something that keeps evolving to this day. Thanks to car suspension, we can now absorb lots of those dips and bumps to a certain extent without being thrown out of the car. However, it's important to remember that the suspension is directly linked to the chassis and the body of the car, which means that every time the suspension does its thing, some of the forces are transferred to the chassis and body. So if for example you drive over a pothole with your front left wheel, you will notice that this side of the car will dip down and then back up, whilst the suspension on the other corners will also adjust in order to stabilize the car. In other words, when you drive on the rougher roads, the suspension on each corner of the car should be constantly going up and down separately. From the outside, the chassis and body are constantly moving or twitching or bouncing, however you want to call it. However, in WRC10 we can barely see any of that, even on rough roads. The suspension soaks up everything whilst the body remains extremely composed and almost completely level. It should be constantly juttering or dancing as it were, but that's not the case. Many people have described physics like these in the following way. It's as if you are on a hovercraft or a boat, and I must say that this is definitely the case here, as the footage clearly reflects that as well. What follows now are several other examples of the hovercraft and magnet under the car characteristics I already discussed. Here I'm going slightly off the road onto a bank, and normally in situations like this the bottom of the car receives quite an impact and the rear would be catapulted into the air. However, you clearly saw there was no drama at all and the car and suspension soaked everything up like jelly. Now I held on to this situation for last because it illustrates both aspects perfectly. First there's a bump followed by a dip and an incline. At this speed in the real world, the car and suspension would have to endure quite an impact, something which should definitely unsettle the car. Instead the car just glides over it like nothing's there and sticks to the road like glue, even at the top of the incline where it should lift off the ground slightly because it's basically a small jump. Another thing I picked up on is something that happens once you surpass a certain rotational angle when oversteering or sliding. This was also something that was present in WRC9. So when you push the pedal to the floor whilst there is a minor oversteer, the refs keep going up. When that oversteer increases at some angle, the refs start to go down slightly and then remain there even though the throttle is completely down. Just as if the traction control kicks in, which it shouldn't in my case because I turned it off. If you then create even more oversteer at a certain angle, the refs suddenly shoot up and you almost instantly hit the limiter. It's something which is very odd, and unfortunately I wasn't able to record proper footage of it because the demo was no longer live. The final aspect of the car physics I'll discuss has to do with the way the cars change direction. Now there has always been a heated debate surrounding the Dirt Rally 2.0 physics, especially those on tarmac. And when fans of both franchises are butting heads, it usually gets ugly very quickly. The two main arguments coming from the diehard WRC fanboys are the cars look like they're doing four-wheel slides when cornering and they have a central pivoting point from which they rotate. They usually follow that up by adamantly saying that this is not the case in WRC 9 or 10, which means their games have superior physics and handling. Right, so as many of you might know, I'm a bit of a Dirt Rally 2.0 fanboy, and personally I prefer the physics in that game over those in WRC 9 or WRC 10. But I am fully aware that the Dirt Rally 2.0 physics are not perfect. There is truth to those two criticisms raised by the WRC lads, and I acknowledge that. However, you can resolve most of it with some setup tweaks, and when you are actually driving you don't really feel or notice it. It's only when you watch replay footage that it becomes obvious. Now I do completely disagree with the WRC fans claiming that WRC 9 and 10 lack those two traits and that the handling in their games is far superior, especially on tarmac. As you might be well aware by now, I'm not a man that just says someone is wrong and calls them an idiot for saying something like this. Oh no, I'm someone who disagrees, doesn't resort to name calling, and backs up his arguments with evidence. Do you know what? When watching WRC 10 footage with the camera set behind the car, it is crystal clear that the cars are indeed also rotating on a central pivoting point. I can give you countless examples, but I'll just show you a few. Remember, I'm not using a controller but a wheel set at 450 degrees of rotation. With the car and tyre physics done and dusted, let's quickly discuss the final bit, which is surface physics, before wrapping up the video. So the main aspect I'd like to address here has to do with the gravel surface. Gravel roads consist of a hard layer that is covered by a loose layer on top. When rally cars drive on those roads, their tyres are designed to dig through the loose layer in order to reach the hard layer where the grip can be found. The team behind the Dirt Rally franchise have done an amazing job in replicating this. Grip levels can change from corner to corner depending on how deep the ruts are or how much loose gravel is on top. KT Racing on the other hand didn't bother with that loose layer. Basically what you have in WRC 10 is just a single layer, which is the hard one. That becomes very clear when you drive over bits of the road where there are small ruts, for example. You should feel something when you drive in or over these ruts. Your steering wheel should also jerk left or right as you hit them, but nope, they don't seem to have any effect. No matter where you drive on the stage, the grip level of a specific type of gravel never changes. The only time the grip level does change is when you go from one type of gravel onto another. Everybody that has driven the stage in Estonia will know this. The lighter gravel gives you quite decent grip, but once you hit the darker gravel in the forest, all of a sudden there's a lot less of it. So finally we have reached the end of the extensive deep dive into the WRC 10 demo. Or should I perhaps call it the WRC 10 Open Beta, because that would be more accurate. Demos are usually a small slice of the full content of a completed and almost fully optimized game. However, as we found out, this demo does not fall into that category. I have been part of a few open betas in the past and it felt very similar to those. There is still time to polish the game before it launches, but some of the core elements that should have been addressed weren't and won't be prior to release. So what are the conclusions I can draw from all this? Let's sum up the good, the average and the ugly. The good things are the UI, the co-driver and Pacenotes, the stage layout and the massively improved force feedback. The average elements then are the peripheral support, the graphics, the particle effects and the physics. And last but not least, the ugly parts are high-end peripheral support plus VR and motion rig support, the graphical optimization, 3D model textures and audio and sound quality. To end this video, I'll quickly touch on my concerns for WRC 10 and the KT Racing developed WRC franchise titles as a whole. Most of the issues I have encountered in their WRC titles over the years can be traced back to their overall development philosophy. For them, working with the official WRC license seems like a portfolio project rather than a passion project. When we look at their track record, we clearly see that KT Racing takes the quantity over quality approach. More and new stuff is always better. The team behind the Dirt Rally franchise takes the opposite approach and that results in the splendid overall quality in their products time and time again. And even though it's fun getting such a large variety of content from KT Racing year after year, the fact remains that a lot of it doesn't receive the love and attention to detail some of it desperately deserves. That's especially the case for updating content from previous iterations. Eventually we always end up having WRC games stuffed with lots of content, but unfortunately almost none of it can be labelled as true quality content. And on that note I'll finish the WRC 10 demo deep dive. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like. If you want to enjoy more of our content, consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell. It would be much appreciated as this helps out the channel quite a lot. Thank you once again for watching, good luck and goodbye.